I'm a proud father of three, and even more proud grandfather of two. And I'm working for their future.
Thank you, Shuli and Aman. You know, you're going to hear different perspectives in the course of this day, and that's how it should be. I'm going to sit in on be part of a panel later that talks about discrimination, and just for those who will be there, for those who won't be there, I'll give you a preview. I actually believe that the laws of the State of Israel are pretty good on these issues. That the biggest problem in Israel is not the absence of laws that regulate these issues. The biggest problem in Israel is about implementation, enforcement, execution, and the mindset of the public that brings us to a place where de facto, not de jure, de facto, life strongly favors the Jewish majority in Israel. That's just a reality. And you see it in lots of ways. You see it in per capita income being half in the Arab sector what it is in the Jewish sector. You see it in higher rates of infant mortality. You see it in lower levels of educational attainment. You see it in a myriad of ways. And yet, the status today, the situation today, is dramatically different in a positive way, in many positive ways than it was a generation ago. And in some ways, the social climate is more worrisome today than it's been in a very long time. And I think we're going to hear about all of those things, all tied together. It's not one or the other. It's all of it is part of the reality. And I want to now turn the floor to Amal and Shuli to unpack some of those issues, to unpack their own life stories and the work that they do as civil society activists and leaders in Israel, to help us learn more about this complicated, intertwined set of good news and challenges and all of that in one package. So it's a big task. Take 10 or 15 minutes and lead us down that path a little bit.
Thank you. Well, I think it's not about only about implementations. It's about the way how the Israeli government actually approach the Arab-Palestinian Israeli inside Israel. And the way I come from the Negev, where 200,000 people are living in the Negev, who make 30% of the whole population in the Negev, and actually sitting in only 3% of the land of the Negev, 30% who are sitting in 3% of the land of the Negev, and still the government of Israel is seeing that this is more than enough for the Arab Bedouin to live, and they are trying by Providence Plan and other plans to push the Arab Bedouin community to live in only 1% of the land of the Negev. So I am putting this challenge right on the table because this is one of the challenges that we are facing now these days in Israel, and we are leading a campaign to bring the Israeli government to understand that the Bedouin community are there, and the government has to choose whether they want them as positive people to contribute to their societies and their lives, or having them there with violence, poverty, and bad conditions. The way that the Israeli government view and approach the Arabs as one, security threat, the other is demographic threat, the third is kind of an obstacle to develop the areas. And if we are talking about equal citizenship, and if we are talking about inclusion, then how could we think about equal citizenship if, when they are talking about my people in the Negev area, the Arab Bedouins, usually it would be an issue for the Malal and not for the government. And Malal, it's the National Security Office. Why I am a security issue? I am a citizenship. Why when it comes to me, then you hear the Giora Island in the radio saying, well, we have a big problem with the Bedouin community. They have 8, 9 kids. Well, instead of saying that, provide one high school in the unrecognized villages, and you will see that once the girls get high school education, that issue will be resolved by itself. Why should we think this way and not the other way? The way that we can build on it and not a way to blame the Arab Bedouin community for having 9, 10 kids. take myself as an example. I am one of 13 kids, and I have only twins, and I cannot think about myself having the third kid. I'm telling you the truth, and it's only one generation after my mother. And the only difference between my mother and me is that I got education, and I got the opportunity to be educated and to get work and to be in the job and having no time to think about having more kids and thinking that this is not the only job that I do in my life, that there is out there jobs and things that I want to do. So this is how the mindset of the government when they look at the Arab citizens of the state of Israel. It's whether security, demographic, or obstacles. Once the government stop having this kind of paradigm, then things will be changed. The other thing is that the mainstream, the Jewish mainstream, the Jewish citizens of the state of Israel have no, understanding that democracy is all about minority rights. They can travel from Herzliya Pituach to Eilat, passing through the Arab unrecognized Bedouin villages in their ways, and seeing these villages without water, without electricity, and not asking themselves a single question. Why is that? Why is that people in a democratic state are living in a situation without water, without electricity, and without roads? We know, and Ami mentioned that, the gaps between the Arab minority and the Jewish majority are huge in all fields of life. Just to mention that Bougie Herzog in Yafo conference said that Jewish kids get 6 times more than the Arab kids in the welfare budget. And we are talking about a community, for example, my community, 60% living under the poverty line. And we are talking about a situation that there is no budget for the welfare services. So you can imagine what's going on there. We are talking about a situation in the Bedouin community that 50% are still living in the situation of the unrecognized villages. These villages exist, but you won't see them in the maps. You won't see that these villages are there, means that there is no services, there is no infrastructures. So if we are talking about the situation of the Bedouin community, also we are talking about the situation of the women in the Arab community. You talked about 20% of only 20% of the Arab women who are in the workforce. Yes, but you have to understand that 50% of the women, the Arab women in the north, are having at least university degree, and they are unemployed. So you can imagine, when it comes to the Negev, it's a different story. We are talking about 87% unemployed among the Bedouin women. We are talking about 43% unemployed among the men themselves. We are talking about 65% under the age of 18. So we are talking about a very young community. Now, when we come to the ministry, and believe me, I am a person who is not working in advocacy in a way that I put a position paper and organize the demonstration, which is okay and which is good. But I learned that if I am not bringing the right best practices from my own community and from my own field and bring that to the government to adapt it, because I'm a citizen of the state of Israel and I want the government to take responsibility, it won't work. Only having position papers, it's not going to change the situation inside Israel. I'm working with the Ministry of Labor, I'm working with the Ministry of Education, I'm working with the Ministry of Welfare. And when you sit with the Ministry of Labor saying to you, well, Amal, I know that, in the Bedouin community, it's your mentality and it's your traditions that not, letting the women going and work. Excuse me, look at me. I am from the Bedouin community. I didn't came from Canada. And I am the one to lead the women empowerment programs in my community. And I said to him, listen carefully. If there is an opportunity, mentality also changed. Don't use this as an excuse not to provide services. And the other thing is that if we really want to talk about women's employment in the Arab community, guys, we are talking about a situation that there is no public transportations between the villages. We're talking about the situation that there is no frameworks for children, that the mothers can leave the children in these frameworks and go for work. In the Arab Bedouin population in the Negev, the only frameworks that exist in the unrecognized villages were the frameworks that we, by AJIC, our Arab Jewish Center for Equality, Empowerment, and Cooperation, set up. And it was a big challenge with the Israeli government. At the first time, they said, you are crazy. You want us to build buildings in unrecognized villages. It's, it's illegal. It's this. And I said, I don't want to have your money. Just come and sit around the table and try to understand what we are doing here. And we succeeded. After 3 years, the best advocates for our early childhood program was the head of the early childhood issue in the Ministry of Labor. So this is when we are talking about trying to bring the services in a way that we bring the Israeli government to adapt the programs that we start as the community. The programs are suitable. The program is fitting to our culture, our community, and our reality. The third thing that I want to talk about it is what's going on these days in terms of the Negev and the Arabs in the Negev. I mentioned that the Arabs are today actually sitting in 3% of the land of the Negev, and we are making 30% of the population of the Negev. And there is no way to talk about developing the Negev where we still having 30% of the population facing very, very tough challenges in terms of basic rights and basic needs. 2 years ago, the Israeli government at that time, 3 years ago, by Olmert, before Bibi Netanyahu, they set up a committee headed by the Judge Goldberg to try to listen to the Arab Bedouin population and try to understand the land issue that we claim ownership of our lands, and the government of Israel is not recognizing this ownership. And the judge was sitting with us, and he listened and heard 172 people represent the situation of the Bedouin community in Israel, in the southern part of Israel. And the end of his year, he put together a recommendation, and the first sentence that he wrote, that I understand that for the last 60 years, Israel, in even one time, didn't relate to the Bedouin community as citizens of the state of Israel. And I ask and demand the Israeli government to look at the Arabs in the Negev as citizens of the state of Israel. And then he gave these recommendations to the government that, Bibi Netanyahu, and the recommendations were very positive, in Bibi Netanyahu's eyes. And now they are talking about a privacy plan where 2 years they put the recommendations of the Judge Goldberg aside, and they start working on putting an implementation plan for the Bedouin community. This implementation plan includes uprooting more than 100,000 people from their unrecognized villages to the 7 townships that the Israeli government planned in the late 60s, which these villages are the most disadvantaged communities in Israel. So you can imagine having more people coming into these villages that already they have no infrastructure for having more people coming in. And I'm talking about a situation where these villages exist. We're not talking about 3 and 5 houses up there, or 3 or 5 houses up there that we want the government of Israel to recognize. We are talking about villages that more than 2,000 people are living there. And we put an alternative plan to the Israeli government where we want the Israeli government to recognize another 36 unrecognized villages that all of them fits the criteria of the housing and planning in the Ministry of Housing. So talking about the Arab Bedouin population today and what we are facing, I urge you to do something, because what we are facing these days, that by legislation, by these plans, we all are losing what we really desire, a democratic state. This is not about left wing or right wing, it's about democracy. And I urge every one of you who cares about the situation in Israel, we need your help to write letters to try to influence the makers in Israel to stop these policies towards the Arab Palestinian minority inside Israel. Thank you very much.